We stopped checking for monsters under our bed once we realised they were inside us. "Don't turn the lights off, please, Mommy," he said timidly, fear resonating in his voice. His mother laughed lovingly and assured him the nightlight would provide sufficient lighting from whatever he feared would come forth from the darkness once she had left. "Okay, but please check in my closet before you go," he asked of his mother meekly. She decided to humour him and did as he asked. Once satisfied nothing was in there, he seemed a little more at ease, his young head against the soft pillow. She passed by his bed and kissed his forehead lovingly. "Good night, my sweet boy," she whispered as she stood upright. "I love you, Mommy," he chimed in as she left. Just before she shut the door, "I love you too, Aaron," she said with a smile on her face as the door sealed him in from the rest of the house. Once she had left, the room immediately became tenfold scarier. The pale nightlight, rather than being reassuring, cast an eerie glow across the room, prompting shadows to dance in the darkness to some unheard tune. Aaron lay in bed, gripping the covers tightly at his chin. His mother had left the closet door ajar. If he but even closed his eyes with it unclosed, he would be vulnerable to whatever he was sure resided in there. Once the lights were off, he had to close it if he hoped to get any sleep. He looked around the room for some sort of defense against the creatures that might attack him once he tried to disrupt their plan of escaping. His eyes happened upon the baseball bat propped up against the wall near the door. He scrambled out of bed, disrupting the dance of the shadows as his colossal shadow flickered across the room as he passed through the pale glow of the light on his way to his weapon. Holding the bat in trembling hands, he scanned the room for any possible assailants. Aaron had broke out into a cold sweat. He could feel the shirt of his pajamas sticking tightly to his torso as his brow accumulated sweat. He wondered if the monsters could smell fear. If they could, he was in for it. He probably reeked of fear. And sweat, of course. He held the bat tight and took a step forward. He was going to shut the closet door. Each step felt as though he was wearing lead boots. It was almost painful walking towards what very might be your death. Dead man walking, as they would say. The shadows had begun to dance again. Perhaps it was a dance of death. Aaron began to wonder what the monster would do to him if the bat could not protect him. He could almost see it slowly stretching out to its full size, towering above him, picking him up and bringing him closer to it. Its horribly scarred face, full of blisters and warts, pouring out a gooey slime. The dead look in its eyes and row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. Would it bite his head clean off, or simply devour him whole? Aaron came back to reality, as he was now at the closet door. He turned back to check the room, once more to see if perhaps one of them had found a way around him. There was nothing. Thankfully he could see his room almost perfectly. His creased sheet lay half on the floor, half on the bed, probably from when he had scrambled out of it. The various toys scattered around the room seemed to have gathered to bear witness to the grand event that was about to unfold. The curtains rustled lightly. He had probably just forgotten to close the window properly. Aaron took a deep breath and decided he would face the monster rather than simply shutting the closet door. He exhaled quickly and swung the closet door wide open, bat high above his head and ready to face his doom. He breathed yet another deep breath, but the exhalation was more of a sigh of relief than anything. There was no monster. He He felt emboldened by the fact he would have taken any monster head on. He was a warrior, at least in his eyes he was. He could take on anything. At the back of his mind he was almost disappointed now. His adrenaline was rushing. He could feel the blood in his cheeks and hear it in his ears. He was ready to fight a monster. He made his way back to his bed, but with his newfound bravery decided to close the window first. Usually Aaron would be too scared to open the curtain in the dark out of fear of what would be behind the curtain, or worse yet, what might be looking in on him from the outside. But he was brave now. He was a would-be monster killer. He could close a window, and bare looking out the dark window, he approached the curtain and flung the curtain back, bat prepped to swing at any monsters hiding behind it. Nothing. Dang, monsters are scared now, he thought, with a smile on his face. They know I'm not scared, and I've got a bat, he told himself. Reaching for the window, he saw it was closed. Realizing his eyes must have played a trick on him in the dark, with nothing but the pale light to provide for his sight, he returned to his bed and threw the bat at the foot of his bed before jumping on it. The adrenaline had washed over him, and he now felt ready for bed, confident in the fact that there were no monsters, as well as the fact he had conquered his fear by means of facing that which could have possibly been lurking in the closet. He reached over the edge of his bed to pull up the cover that had been a casualty of his fear, excitement, and had fallen to the ground. Groping for the covers, his heart skipped a beat as he felt not only the cover, but something much softer beneath the covers. He had probably dropped the covers on one of his many stuffed animals. He slung himself over the bed to retrieve not only the cover, but the stuffed animal too, as some company in bed would be very welcome after his ordeal and excitement. The smell washed over him, first as his head neared the edge of the bed. The smell has no description, but if one had to put a name to it, it smelled of death. It penetrated his nostrils. As it grew worse, he raised the covers, beneath which was not a stuffed animal, the decomposed face. It tried to smile, but the skin around its face was non-existent, and so the smile was just it bearing a few rotten teeth still in its head. "Why don't you come play down here with me, where it's nice and dark?" it said, as it reached a bony and fleshless hand up and pulled Aaron by the throat into the darkness. Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content. Death. That was the odour that occupied the room. The pungent smell of vomit and sweat was evident, but the stench of rotting, dead flesh was predominant. David looked fearfully at his mother, lying helpless on the bed. He knew she was sick, but the sight of her disease-eaten flesh made him feel an array of emotions. With fear being the front runner, he was scared for his mother. He did not want her to die, but the fear was also for his own well-being. The imminent fear that it could be contagious made him keep his distance. His father sat holding his mother's hand. The bits of the hand that remained, that is. The disease had stripped his caregiver of most of the muscle and flesh she had once used to nurture and care for him. All the money and power his father had was of no use against a disease such as this. World-renowned doctors and specialists had been called as soon as his mother had exhibited signs of the sickness, all to no avail. Disease does not discriminate. Janice was suffering just as the poor do, dying with no means of recovery. Necrotizing facets was the name for what ailed his mother. He had heard it on the news a while before he saw it plague his mother, the flesh-eating disease. Or if the stories he had heard around school before it closed were anything to go on, the zombie disease was a more applicable diagnosis. The fever and nausea were the first symptoms. Janice was unable to take her son to school, lying weak in her bed with her temperature climbing steadily. David's father, Jonathan, put it down to a bug of sorts and simply picked up the slack by doing the duties around the house his wife was unable to do. By the second week of sickness, Janice was completely unable to move, with her fingers and toes taking on a darkish hue. David had continued to go to school and had heard of many of the kids talk about other people suffering from a similar sounding sickness. But in all the stories he had heard, none of them ended well. Fearing for his mother's health, David repeated these stories to his father, only to be met with reassurance and comfort. That reassurance and comfort proved to be meaningless as he now sat looking at the disease-riddled body of his mother, flesh eaten beyond comprehension, holes gaping in places unimaginable. Jonathan had tried his best by all means. As soon as he saw his wife's condition deteriorate, a number of doctors were called for consultation. They all came to the same prognosis. According to the doctors looking after her, she was one of the first to be stricken by the disease, and just as the others had, her condition had progressed. Their only suggestion was to move her to the hospital wing they had designated to those afflicted with the disease. Before moving her, Jonathan thought to take David to see the hospital where they would care for his mother. They discussed the matter with her and decided to make the trip the next day. "You've been avoiding me, baby," Janice said once alone with David. "I'm just scared, Mum. I don't want you to die," came David's reply. Laughing, Janice told David, "That's not something you need to worry about, my son. What you do need to worry about is how comfy my room there is going to be," joining in with his mother's laughter. David finally dropped his inhibitions and sat close to his mother. Resting his head on her bed, she stroked his head as he fell asleep. He had not slept long at the bedside of his mother, but his dreams were those of zombies and those that hunted. Necrotizing facets. His father woke him to go to bed, and the disturbance of the dreams was a thorough welcome by David. Walking half asleep towards the door, he could but help glance back at his mother. He could feel the tears well up as the woman lying in the bed closely resembled those creatures that haunted his dream. The drive to the hospital the next day was excruciating. The silence seemed to drill deep into David's core as he sat next to his father. He could feel the sadness and pain emanating from the man he had always viewed as an absolute pillar of strength and wisdom. When the journey had finally ended and they sat in the car park of the hospital, David suddenly burst into tears. The stark reality of the possibility of losing his mother had hit him like a freightliner, moving at remarkable speeds. His father hesitated for a second, unsure of what the appropriate response would be, given that he too felt so unable to do anything he wanted to cry to. He held his son. The two embraced tightly and said nothing. No words could have helped either feel better. The dark clouds drifting in the sky outside them closely resembled the way both of them felt inside, cold and lost. The bright lights in the hospital corridor beat down on them. They winced as they walked in, waiting for their eyes to adjust. "Good morning. We're here to view and book a room in the CDC wing, please," Jonathan asked. We're sorry to inform you. There has been an incident in the CDC room, sir. We're not accepting any new patients at the moment." "What? That's preposterous. What kind of incident?" Jonathan shouted at the nurse. Before she could answer, the doors to the CDC wing burst open, and what looked like the remains of a man ran through the doors, leaving footprints of blood behind him. He lunged at a woman seated on the chairs outside the Centre for Disease Control, and people were too shocked to respond. Pinning her down, Jonathan and David could see the sick man biting and clawing at the woman's face. Blood and flesh flew everywhere. He had more holes in him than flesh. Bits of bone could be seen through the loose hanging hospital gown that covered the eaten man. The disease had all but devoured his body, and it was a miracle he was able to move. "Does that answer your question, sir?" the nurse screeched as she made a beeline for the exit. Dragging David, Jonathan followed the panicked crowds through the door and towards the car park. The only people left in the hospital were the zombie-looking individual and his victim. Well, what was left of her after he had eaten his fill and pulled all her intestines out through the hole he had chewed in her stomach. Rushing to get in the car, David and Jonathan said nothing as they ran and pushed their way through the crowds to get where they were going. Locking themselves in their car, they merely sat where they were, not moving and not saying anything, bursting into tears once again. David was the only one to finally break the silence. "We have to get home to Mom, Dad." As they pulled into the driveway, Jonathan had already begun giving David instructions. "As soon as we get in, you need to go up to your room and pack a bag. We're going to go straight to the airport and get on a plane to India. Your Uncle Kieran mentioned something about doctors working on stuff like this there. We'll take your mother, and this will be all sorted out. Come straight to the room when you're packed." Almost as soon as the car was stationary, David leapt out of the car and ran up the driveway and into his house. Jonathan was close behind. As Jonathan made his way into his bedroom, he could hear his son cursing and banging his cupboard doors. He too would pack a bag for him and his wife, and they would leave to a safer place. Having finished packing some clothes into a bag, David closed it and ran out of his room. The tears had begun to dry, and a smile crept over his face at the thought of 3 of them flying to India to make Mum better. Who knows, maybe Uncle Kieran would be waiting at the airport for them. Bursting through the door of his parents' room, the smile that had recently formed once again dissolved to tears. There would be no trip to the airport, let alone India. Straddling her husband on their bed, David could see his mother. Her head was buried in her husband's chest, as she feasted. Jonathan's hand dangled off the bed, drenched in his own blood. The only thing David could hear over his loud breaths was the grotesque sound of his mother chewing and slurping the bits of flesh and blood she was stuffing her face with. Standing there frozen, David saw his mother turn to face him. What now looked him in the eye was not his mother. Blood dripping from its chin, dead eyes staring, it stood up, leaving Jonathan lying on the bed with holes chewed in his body. David felt his legs give out. "Mom," he said weakly, tears streaming down his cheeks, hoping something inside of the creature would hear and recognize her son, and perhaps grant him mercy. The ground seemed to shake as it took a step towards him. Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content. When Sarah was small, she used to always be afraid of the dark. She hated the dark even more now, and she hated her own shadow. It started when she was 7 years old. Her and her twin sister were in their room, and they borrowed a horror book from their mom. Sarah was spooking her twin sister Katie out by pretending there was shadows going to get her, and they were on the wall. Sarah realized that she could make shadows on the wall and spooked Katie out every time she turned around. Suddenly something fell, and Katie got such a fright she backed back and fell off her bunk bed and out the top story window and was killed instantly. 15 years later, Sarah still gets flashbacks every time she sees her own shadow. She went to counselling and everything over it. She knew she had to get rid of her fear. She knew it was awful what happened, but she knew she had to finally put it behind her. She wasn't going to look at her shadow anymore. What Sarah couldn't see, as she was walking down the street, is her own shadow take out a knife. Suddenly she heard a voice saying, "Don't you think you can outrun your shadow?" Sarah was certain she had shook off her obsession of her shadow, but turned around because she knew that the voice was not in her head. She froze in horror, because in all the years she just saw her shadow, not her shadow moving differently than her, and definitely not her shadow holding a knife. Suddenly the shadow lunged the knife into her and walked into her, then healed instantly and walked down the street. Katie was practicing walking down the street. "Hi, my name is Sarah." Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content.